It's a funny thing about Roald Dahl. The guy wrote some of the most beloved children's books ever while having some of the biggest cranky old man vibes imaginable. He was one opinionated bastard, going on long rants in his books about kids who chew gum or how television was going to be the death of society. Okay, we might give him that one, but not the stuff he said about Jewish people or how the Oompa Loompas were originally written as African pygmies. He was even worse when it came to adaptations of his work, reportedly standing outside the local cinema showing The Witches with a megaphone urging people not to see it. But the man knew what kids want: underdog heroes, memorably awful villains, a heaping helping of whimsy, and more than a touch of darkness. And that gives his work a certain amount of both durability and adaptability. So let's talk about one of Dahl's most beloved books and the source for arguably the best musical adaptation of his work, Matilda. To understand the dynamics of a lot of Dahl's work, and Matilda specifically, you have to dig into the hellscape that was British schools in the early 20th century. Corporal punishment was the rule more than the exception, with canes, shoes, and a leather strap called the tawse being the most common implements of choice. Less physically painful discipline might include menial labor, writing lines, or public humiliations like wearing the iconic dunce cap. And the older kids often got in on the fun, forcing underclassmen into servant roles or occasionally being allowed to administer punishments themselves. Yeah, it was pretty much a breeding ground for every type of awful abusive behavior you could imagine, and it's no wonder it left a powerful impression on Dahl's psyche and writing. So here's how it originally went down. After ruminating on the tendency for parents to consider their children wonderful in spite of empirical evidence, Dahl introduces us to a couple who go to the opposite extreme, the boorish, television-obsessed Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood. They have two children, but it is the younger, Matilda, who gets the brunt of their neglect and disdain. Despite this inauspicious upbringing, Matilda is astonishingly brilliant, reading adult books and doing complicated math in her head by the age of 5, and also possesses a good nature and a firm moral compass. She uses the latter to secretly punish her parents, especially her father, a crooked used car dealer, with amusing pranks, but meets an even bigger challenge when she's sent to school at Cruncham Hall. The headmistress, Miss Trunchbull, is a child-hating brute with an endless supply of horrific torments for her charges, throwing girls by their pigtails, holding boys up by their ears, forcing a child who snuck a piece of cake to gorge himself on the remainder in front of the student body, and locking kids up in a kind of jerry-rigged Iron Maiden called the Chokey. Matilda's teacher, sweet Miss Honey, does what she can to encourage Matilda's gifts under the circumstances, but the Trunchbull has it in for the child, and one day, after a particularly nasty encounter, Matilda discovers that she can move things with her mind. She reveals this to Miss Honey, who in turn reveals that she lives in poverty in a dilapidated cottage, having been cheated out of her inheritance by an abusive aunt after the suspicious death of her father, the aunt being none other than Miss Trunchbull herself. Using this knowledge and her mental powers, Matilda causes a piece of chalk to write an ominous message to the horrified Miss Trunchbull, making her flee the town in terror. Miss Honey's fortunes are restored, and Matilda is moved up to the top form in her school. With her mental energy devoted to the new challenge of her schoolwork, Matilda's telekinesis soon fades, but she doesn't mind and develops a close relationship with Miss Honey. When Mr. Wormwood's criminal dealings finally catch up with him and the family is forced to flee the country, Matilda successfully begs to stay behind with Miss Honey, embracing her happily as her horrible birth family disappears from her life forever. Matilda is, in part, Dahl's paean to the value of books and reading in the face of painful reality and the easy but generally less stimulating entertainment of television. The musical expands this into a commentary on the power of stories in general, exemplified by the subplot where Matilda creates a story to entertain the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. Bizarrely, what seems to be a whimsical tale concocted from the people and events around Matilda ends up being the backstory for Miss Honey. On one hand, it's an interesting and creative way to give this information to the audience, rather than have the character info-dump the whole thing in the middle of the second act. On the other, it does add to the ambiguity around Matilda's strange abilities. Is she psychic as well as telekinetic? As is often the case in magical realism, the answer doesn't actually matter. It is what it is, and that's enough. Because the focus of Matilda, the musical, isn't just about Matilda's rebellion against cruel and careless authority figures, but about the broader rebellion she inspires. She encourages and catalyzes others to take a stand against the trunchbull, whether it's Bruce Bogtrotter turning his punishment by excess into a defiant act of malicious compliance, or Miss Honey finally defying the woman who has tormented her entire life. And I think that's important, because making a difference in the real world requires more than one plucky underdog to fix everything. And because civil disobedience isn't always a big demonstration. Sometimes it's just being a little bit naughty.